And now Greta Thunberg is here to tell us why her anti-Israel crusade is linked to climate change.
As Israel bombs hospitals, homes, and schools in Gaza, Chevron supplies them with energy.
I'm the professor of history and of African studies and chair of the faculty senate. We have, over these past 2 years, opened our hearts to the injustice and inhumanity of Israel's war in Gaza.
Democracy Now! Spoke to Columbia and Barnard College students yesterday who set up a Gaza solidarity encampment.
Why do you think Palestine is the question, the moral question of our generation?
In Gaza, in the West Bank, from Ferguson to Palestine, resistance is not a crime.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight as we examine not just a conflict, but the broader narrative framework through which much of the world has come to interpret it. Over the past 2.5 years, many of us have watched something larger than a war unfold. We've watched the emergence of a broader narrative framework, one that increasingly interprets not only Israel and Gaza, but global morality, politics, power, victimhood, colonialism, and even Western identity itself, through a highly selective and emotionally charged lens centered on Israel. Tonight's conversation is about that phenomenon. Our guest, Matti Friedman, has described this framework using the term Gazology, the idea that Gaza has become not merely a place or a conflict zone, but a kind of symbolic organizing principle through which broader world events and moral narratives are increasingly filtered and interpreted. This conversation is not simply about media bias in the narrow sense. It's about narrative framing, moral simplification, information ecosystems, and the way contemporary journalism increasingly shapes not only what people know, but how they understand reality itself. Why do certain conflicts become global obsessions while others fade into the background? Why do some forms of suffering become universally legible while others remain invisible? How do narratives flatten complexity into emotionally coherent stories of oppressor and oppressed, good and evil? And what happens to journalism and democratic discourse when narrative begins to overtake complexity? To explore these questions, we're very pleased to be joined tonight by Matti Friedman. Matti is an award-winning journalist and author. His work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Tablet, and Smithsonian. And he currently writes a column for the Free Press. His most recent book, Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe, was published earlier this year to great acclaim. His work has received numerous recognitions, including the Canadian Jewish Book Award, and his works have been translated into more than a dozen languages. Over the past several years, and especially since October 7th, Matti has also become one of the clearest and most incisive voices examining the international media environment surrounding Israel and the broader narrative frameworks through which that conflict is interpreted globally. Moderating tonight's discussion is Tristan Hopper, journalist and columnist with the National Post, whose writing on Canadian politics, culture, and public discourse has made him one of the country's most distinctive commentators. I'm so excited to have both of you here with us tonight. Thank you so much for being here. And Tristan, I will throw it over to you.
Sure, Mr. Friedman. So basically, I read this piece as you just looked at a bookshelf groaning with books, and this is sort of an experience I've had as well. You go to the bookstore, and there's an entire shelf of books all written about Gaza. So Gazology is basically you going through a selection of these books and sort of reviewing them, quick reviews. I don't know if that would be a fair interpretation, but one through line through almost all of these books, at least as you describe them, is that they could have been written without the author ever going outside or doing anything remotely resembling journalism. authors didn't go to Gaza, they didn't speak to Gazans, they don't know anything, they don't know any Gazans. They may struggle to find Gaza on a map. Is this fair? In these books that you review, is there no actual original information in any of them?
First of all, it's wonderful to be here with you, Tristan. This essay, which was published in the Free Press called Introduction to Gazology, did start literally, as you described, with a bookshelf in a bookstore in Washington, D.C., where I just found myself a few months ago. I like to go into independent bookstores when I'm in North America because I live in Israel, so I don't have a lot of access to them here, of course. I went into a bookstore in D.C. and saw that the shelf of Gaza books, which kind of Gaza in broad terms could be books about Palestine or the evils of Zionism, but most of the books had Gaza in the title. The shelf was almost a full shelf of these books, and most of them seemed to be new. So in the past, if I had been checking out the Mideast section at a bookstore like this, there would have been a few similar titles. There's always been a kind of subgenre on the Marxist left about the evils of Zionism, and you would find maybe 3 or 4 of those titles. But now we're talking about an entire shelf of books that were about or claimed to be about the war in Gaza. And I realized that a new genre had been born and that it required analysis. So I sat down and read 5 of these books, and the result is this essay which tries to see the genre as kind of as a literary genre. And I tried to understand what the authors are trying to say. And I just want to say, just before we even dive into the content, I'm not talking about the reporting of the war in Gaza. So these books are not books of reportage about Gaza. When I talk about Gazology, I'm not referring to an analysis of the very real human tragedy in Gaza, which is tragic and awful, certainly for me as an Israeli living through it over the past 2.5 years, for my neighbors who are Palestinian, for people in the broader Middle East. So I'm not belittling the human tragedy. I'm talking about the way this tragedy has been reborn in the world of Western politics and the Western imagination. So circling back to your actual question, yes, it's fair to say that this genre has almost no connection, not no connection, but almost no connection to the real place called Gaza. But many of the writers here are not only not in Gaza or in Israel, many of them seem never to have been here. This is very much a product of our online world where you don't need to be in a place to understand it. You don't need to speak to real people to analyze these people. You don't need to speak a language to understand a political or social situation. It's enough to be on your computer, watching videos, kind of imbibing information on social media. This is, as far as you're concerned, reality. And it suffices for you to declare yourself to be an expert and not only to describe a very complicated geopolitical situation, but judge the people involved in it. So before we even get into what the content actually is, I agree that that's the starting point. The starting point is that reality is accessible through your screen. And I think that's the mistake that underlies this genre and many other misunderstandings afflicting journalists and analysts across the Western world in 2026.
So we're both published authors, and as I'm sort of reading your reviews of all these books, I'm thinking, like, if I went to a publisher and said, "Hey, I got this idea for a book about, the war in Ukraine. I don't speak Ukrainian. I'm not going to go to Ukraine. I don't know, no, I'm not going to speak to any Ukrainians. I'm just going to sort of, scroll the headlines, and then here's my hot take on Ukraine." There's no way in a million years that would be accepted as a book. So I was wondering if you could speak to the incentive structures as to why this is. I mean, why are we going to bookstores? I mean, why is the same book and I think you described they're kind of the same book over and over and over again. Why is the same book being greenlit over and over and over again?
Because where Israel is concerned, we're inhabiting the world of symbols rather than the world of real countries. There's a real difference between the way Israel is covered and the way other international stories are covered for foreign audiences. And I'm saying this as someone who was a reporter and an editor for the Associated Press, which is the big American news agency in Canada. It's called CP, but it's the world's biggest news organization, at least according to the AP. And I was a correspondent here for the AP between 2006 and the very end of 2011. And when you're in the system, you realize that this country is covered in a way that's very different than other countries. For example, when I was at the AP, we had more than 40 full-time news staffers covering Israel. Israel is 1/100th of 1% of the surface of the world. And as a percentage of the land mass of the Arab world, it's 0.2%. So 1/5 of 1%. But we had more reporters here than we had in all of Africa, south of the Sahara. That's 50 something countries. We had more reporters here at the time than we had in China, which is a country of 1.3 billion people. So just to give you a sense of how inflated the coverage of this place is. And when I was in the system, I realized that the coverage was very much a story of symbols rather than actual people caught up in a very complicated situation, making predictably terrible decisions like people tend to do. This was a story about good and evil. It had kind of been elevated into a cosmic parable about oppression, in which Israelis were stand-ins for basically the evil white West, and Palestinians were the incarnation of the innocent third world. Essentially, that's what had been created. So once we're in the world of symbols, and once you don't need to be an expert to write about this because the facts are evident. I mean, everyone knows the facts of this story. You're seeing it on your screen. It's on Twitter. Even back in the old days when I was at the AP, you didn't need to speak Hebrew or Arabic to be a correspondent here. My boss at the AP spoke neither Hebrew nor Arabic. And just to get back to something you said, if I showed up in Canada and claimed to be an expert on Canada without speaking English, Canadians would think that was hilarious. But the people explaining foreign conflicts to Canadians are basically that guy in other countries. And people don't always get that. But so even before this Gaza war, we're already in a situation where coverage of Israel or discourse around Israel is completely disconnected from the actual place and from any expertise that would be required in other countries. So we have October 7th. And then there's this explosion of interest and this very surprising response to October 7th, which, Tristan, I know you've discussed. And people in the West do not respond to the massacres in the way you would expect them to respond. And instead, we find ourselves in a kind of, in many ways, in a changed world where Gaza is becoming the animating cause, the motivating cause for much of the, I guess, what we would call the global left. And I say that with some trepidation because I would place myself on the left, but we're talking about, kind of an anti-Western militancy that now animates a lot of political discourse across the Western world. So now we're in this world where Gaza is getting hundreds of thousands of people out on the street in London, in Paris, in American cities, in Canada, and we have instances of vandalism and instances of violence, and it's all being motivated by this thing called Gaza. And it's a global cause that's disconnected from any place. So when I'm an author coming to pitch this to a publisher, I'm already talking about a global symbol. I'm not, the editor at the publisher who would ask you, were you to pitch a Ukraine book? Tristan, what is your expertise on Ukraine? How much time have you spent in Ukraine? Do you speak Ukrainian? Do you maybe speak Russian? Those questions are not being asked here. These are public intellectuals who have very little interest in the actual people involved, including not just Israelis, who they're completely uninterested in except as a symbol of evil, but they're not even interested in Palestinians. I mean, the authors do almost nothing to speak to actual Palestinians in Gaza about the problems that are driving this terrible conflict. And we're talking about symbols. So if we're in a world of symbols, there's no expertise required. And all you need to do is write some book in which Gaza serves as a symbol of whatever you want to talk about. It could be the climate, it could be feminism, it could be LGBT issues, it could be Western colonialism. It's basically a stand-in for whatever evil you want to discuss.
Reading your piece, Gazology, I felt like as you were sort of diving into these books and sort of the lens through which Gaza is being framed, I felt like I was kind of very familiar with this kind of writing because Canada produces a lot of it, and not just in regards to Gaza. It's certainly a lot of Gaza lately, but it's just this really lazy, narcissistic style in which, as you described, some not tremendously smart academic takes something like whiteness or Zionism and just blames it for all the world's problems. But I find it enraging whenever I encounter it. To just see lies hammered into book-length libels really bothers me, no matter how often I see it. And in Canada, I often see it in government reports. Just see, well, this isn't correct at all. And this is a 300-page report, and it's just sort of the same unproven academic idea over and over and over again. So what's your mental state like when you're working your way through all these books?
Yeah, that's a question coming from someone who's had the experience of actually trying to wade through this stuff, when I think most people would just kind of walk by it and say, but which I would actually much rather do. But I felt that I really had to dive in, and it's exactly that experience where you're just, you would think that a 300-page government report would be impressive and that it would be researched and almost
used to be, yeah.
I think that's true, yeah. And a book published by a mainstream publisher used to be a coherent, even if you didn't agree with the argument, it would be a well-argued, coherent piece of writing by someone who could credibly claim to be an expert on it. And I think many people probably assume that that is still the case. So, there's a 300-page government report. Most people aren't going to read it. They're just going to assume there's something to it. And that's particularly true of Canadians, I think, and being one myself, kind of part of a Canadian personality is a kind of obedience. That's part of the national character. So it's an obedience to authority, and the kind of assumption that the institutions are, have your best interests at heart and that they're doing the right thing. And it takes a while to kind of wean yourself off that assumption. And then when you dive into these books, you see that mainstream publishers are publishing not just nonsense, but poison. I mean, these are libels meant to drive animosity toward Israelis and to a very large extent, I think, Jews, and to a larger extent or a broader extent, the West, what we might call the West, which is, I realize, a problematic and very general term, but it's part of a package of views that I think we're now able to identify, which is kind of a package of views that's meant to undermine what we would think of as the classic Western civilization, or the civilization that gave birth to a place like Canada or America or the UK. And it's really something to see that there is a recognizable ideological framework behind these books, and it's the same ideological framework that I imagine motivates the reports that you're talking about. People have come out of university departments for 10, 20, maybe 30 years with a series of very bad ideas, and they've kind of taken those ideas into the world, and instead of coming at the world with curiosity, with modesty, with an interest in how the world actually works and how we can best change it, the world becomes basically a forum for ideological polemic. So it's just, events are just crammed into these ideological frameworks. You look at a tiny Jewish state of 7 million people amid 300 million Arab Muslims and 2 billion Muslims. And your whole framework for this is these are white oppressors, and anything they do is wrong, and anything that the opponents of the Jews here do must be just. And then, with that assumption, you go and you create an entirely fictional story that is very resonant. So not just resonant, it's also very useful. It's useful because it can be used to mobilize political action in many different countries, and there's no parallel to this. I mean, there's no other cause that can mobilize this number of people in as many countries. This is a very powerful mobilizing tool. And the second reason that it's useful is that it can be applied to different problems. And that's really what Gazology is. It's when you take Gaza and you start applying it to different problems. So one of the books that I talk about is interested in literature and problems in literature seen through Gaza. One is interested in Gaza as a kind of the paradigm of the climate disaster. And this author, who's a Swedish academic, who's also kind of a Marxist with fantasies of violently overthrowing the West, he writes a book that argues that there is an intrinsic connection between Israel and fossil fuels. And it's something to read. And it's completely disconnected from reality, but it has its own internal logic, and it really can be understood.
That's the one that mentions that the first use of steam on a vessel was near the Levant, so thus Israel equals industrial revolution equals rape of the climate. You described it better.
I mean, that's a summary, but I think it's a fair summary. There's an argument there that the British Empire uses steam. I think it's in 1840. This happens to be in the Mediterranean off the coast of what is now Israel. And he draws a connection between that and the beginning of the Zionist movement, and then argues that there is this deep connection between Zionism and coal. Now, you can of course, associate steam with absolutely every single thing that's happened on Earth since steam was invented. And of course, Israel's enemies are the world's biggest fossil fuel producers. But we're not in the world of logic here. We're in the world of ideological polemic, and people are using Israel and Gaza and the Palestinians as tools in whatever ideological platform they're trying to push.
So you wrote Gazology for the Free Press. So they gave it a very, it has a very grand, memorable title, Gazology. If you'd written this for like Vice, it could have been called, I think. I read all the masturbatory book-length Gazan takes, so you didn't have to. And not to diss masturbation in this forum, but I would like to focus on the masturbatory part of these books, because I think you described that well. Namely, that a lot of these authors seem to be very narcissistic. They love themselves. They're ostensibly writing about some history-defining act of evil depravity, but there's whole chapters where they just yammer on about their bourgeois lives. And this is something I see in Canada a lot. You'll take some museum that's just been stripped out of all its exhibits, and it's just a lecture about colonialism and white privilege and whatever. And this is always preceded with a picture of the curators who did it, and we knew better than the people who designed this museum. So there's always sort of a self-love behind this. I mean, is it fair to say that this was definitely a theme you noticed in this book? It didn't take long before the authors were talking about themselves.
It's really striking. It's really striking, and I can use the Canadian example from the books that I chose, which is a book which is probably the best-selling book of all of the Gazology titles. It's called "One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This" by a journalist named Omar El-Akkad, who born in the Gulf. I think his family's Egyptian, and comes to Canada. He's a reporter for the Globe and Mail for a while now. He lives in the States. He lives in Oregon. And his book is, it's worth reading just to see how this genre operates. Because when I started the book, I assumed that I was going to read about the war in Gaza, because the title is that one day everyone will have been against this. And I assumed that the this referred to this war. So I thought he would be interviewing people in Gaza. It's impossible right now for foreign journalists to get into Gaza because of Israeli restrictions. But you can speak to people, of course, on Zoom. It's actually not that hard, and it's a very good idea. And there are heart-rending and awful stories that are totally true that you can report from Gaza. And I opened the book, and it took me a while to realize he's just not interested in Gaza. He makes no effort to speak to actual people in Gaza. It's much more about him, and it's exactly as you describe it. He kind of mopes around, like he's in Montreal and he's in Toronto and he's listening to Nirvana, and then he's in Oregon and his backyard deck collapses, and this seems emotionally significant to him. And I keep waiting for the part where he's going to do some hard-hitting reporting on this terrible war in the Middle East, until I realize that it's not about that. It's actually about him walking through this very fraught moral landscape as a Muslim who immigrated to the West, and kind of passing judgment on various kinds of racism in the West. And he makes kind of the requisite visit to northern Canada, to an Indigenous community, so he acknowledges Indigenous ways of knowing, and kind of terrible, white racism in Canada. And then he's talking about getting hassled on the US-Canada border. And he kind of attributes racism to an interviewer who once asked him, or he relates this episode where he jokes in an onstage interview that he uses Google Translate to translate his books from Arabic or something. And the interviewer believes him, and he interprets this as a kind of ludicrous racism. But why wouldn't the interviewer believe him? It makes no sense. But it is a deeply narcissistic book where Gaza is purely instrumental, and it's not the only example. And it's quite striking to both claim that this is the era defining evil and to ignore it in favor of navel gazing, which is what a lot of these authors are doing.
At the end of Gazology, your piece, Gazology, you sort of sum up a few of the trends, and I think you've delved into them here, but one of them that seems to be something you see quite regularly in anti-Zionism, at least the polite book writing variety of anti-Zionism, which is that you have someone engaging in obsessive annihilationist hatred. So when you're, extrapolating that a steam engine equals Israel equals, I mean, it's not rational. So they're, engaging in this annihilationist obsessive hatred, all while going out of their way to assert that their annihilationist Jew hatred is entirely different from the annihilationist Jew hatred that drove the Holocaust. So it seems all of these books mention the Holocaust in some way, go out of their way to mention Jewish authors, say, all my best friends are Jewish. Does every single author play with some variety of, I'm not a bigot, but...
Yes, I mean some more than others, but there's definitely in almost every book there's a discussion of someone who is, according to the author, anti-Semitic. So there's always someone else who is anti-Semitic, and it's a way of course, making the case that they are not. So for Pankaj Mishra, who's one of the authors of these books, quite a well-known intellectual, born in India, operates mainly in the UK. He calls Roald Dahl an anti-Semite. The Swedish academic with the climate book, he has a discussion of another academic who wrote something about how the Jews run Hollywood, and he's kind of critical of that, as he writes an entire book about how both Israel and the fossil fuel industry need to be destroyed by violence if necessary. And there are many instances that are similar. No one wants to be confused with the wrong kind of people who are hostile to Jews. So almost all of these authors are sophisticated enough, or, they're operating in an environment where you can't just say, I hate these people and I wish they'd go away. So they try to differentiate themselves from the more coarse kinds of animosity, but it's very hard to distinguish, to be quite honest. I mean, this is obviously an intellectual strain of the same animosity, but it would require greater intellects to actually zoom out and say, what is really going on here? Like why does the defense minister of Pakistan, Candace Owens, academics from the University of Toronto, labor union leaders in the UK, hundreds of millions of people across the Islamic world, and increasingly
Canada, don't forget our labor union leaders.
Absolutely, and hundreds of millions of people across the Islamic world, and many Muslims who are in the West. Why do all these people agree about the evil of this specific country? That is a really interesting question. Even if we set aside our emotions for a moment, it's a very interesting intellectual question to ask, but of course it's a very dangerous one, so they can't touch it.
So this is an issue on which it's come up a lot when I'm sort of speaking to people. How do we deal with this insane hatred in the streets? They'll say, well, one of the main problems is we essentially have a relatively new hate movement. So the anti-Zionism thrives on this permission structure that they can differentiate themselves from conventional anti-Semitism. And often it's hard for the broader public to sort of understand this. So this is why, you look at some hate rally, masked men calling for intifada, calling for violence, a level of hatred we've never really seen in a Canadian rally. And then there's always there's the token Jew in it, or there's a token sign saying, we're not anti-Semitic, this is the new Holocaust. So could you speak to that dynamic in these books, in which there's an effort made to say, I'm a froth-mouthed anti-Zionist, but I'm not an anti-Semite. Totally different.
Right. I mean, it's one very confusing part of the discourse. I don't use the word anti-Semitism because I think there's several reasons. One is that anti-Semitism is a term that was invented by someone who hated Jews to make the hatred sound scientific. That's the root of the term. Wilhelm Marr was a journalist, and that term has stuck, but I don't see the necessity of using the terminology of people who hate me. So I try to avoid it. It also is, I think, it's a simple term for something that isn't simple. And it's much, I think, more effective to describe what it is. When I try to really boil down what it is, it's using Jews to illustrate the evil that you see in the world at a given time. So that's more or less what it is. If you think the evil is communism, then the Jews are Bolsheviks. And if you think the evil is capitalism, the Jews are bankers. And if you think that the evil is nationalism, then the Jews are ultranationalists. And if you hate colonialism, the Jews are colonialists. And if you're Christian in the early centuries of the church, the Jews killed Christ. It's whatever if you're into racial purity in Germany in the 20s and 30s, the Jews are the illustration of racial impurity. It's just a way of understanding the world for stupid people. So that I think it's more effective to explain it and then look at what's happening in the world. And I think that it's quite obvious that this vast global campaign against the Jewish state is it meets all the specifications. So, there's this attempt to draw a distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I just see a vast global movement that's trying to destroy the only state that the Jews have, and to, at best, libel into disrepute anyone who supports them, if not actively use violence against them. So I think that this distinction is becoming increasingly threadbare. Even if you can argue it in a university department, it doesn't really matter. Was the guy who just murdered 2 Jews in Manchester outside a synagogue, was he an anti-Semite or an anti-Zionist? Who cares? Are the Iranians who just fired hundreds of ballistic missiles at me, are they anti-Zionists, or are they? I mean, it doesn't. Does it really matter? So I'm not actually that interested in the distinction. If this is a hate movement that targets the vast majority of Jews who either live in Israel or think having a state of Israel is a good idea, that's good enough for me. I think it's vile for that reason, even if it doesn't, answer Wilhelm Marr's conditions for what exactly scientific anti-Semitism was supposed to be. And the word anti-Semitism was meant to replace the older religious forms of hatred of Jews. So, we're in a there's a kind of a game of distinctions here, which I think take up a lot of our time, but actually aren't that helpful if we're actually trying to understand what is really going on.
So I was recently speaking to a Canadian immigrant to Israel, much like yourself, and he said, more recent, but he said most Israelis have no idea that the Western world has this unholy obsession with them. His line to me was, when you've got real terrorists to deal with, college kids pretending to be terrorists doesn't really hit your radar. He struck me as kind of, he's the bummer in any kind of Israeli situation. They're listening to Pink Floyd, and he's like, Roger Waters wants us all dead. And I'm like, shut up. But does this match your experience? So do Israelis know that you walk into any Western bookstore and there's just an entire shelves about how, they're demon people destroying the climate and the planet?
The simple answer is no. Your friend is right, and it's not true of all Israelis. But it took me a long time to figure this out, and actually, it clicked for me only in 2014. I wrote these 2 essays about my time at the AP. One was for the Atlantic, and one was for Tablet, and they made quite a splash. And they're still quoted back at me, and they were translated into Hebrew. And I was on a panel here in Israel that was run by a very prominent Israeli journalist, and I realized as the panel went on that she didn't believe a word that I had written. Like she was not at all aware of anti-Semitism. Sorry to use that word, which I just promised that I would never use. But she basically would not believe that this was a problem in the world. And I realized that this is the way Israelis were raised. So Israel is a response to this animosity, which has been disastrous for Jews across many centuries. Israel is created, and then kids are raised in Israel without it, because that's the whole point of Israel. So they don't believe it exists. So Israelis who are on the liberal side of things tend to think that this problem is actually an invention of the Israeli right. So if you're on the right wing, you think that the world has a problem with Jews, but if you're on the left, you think that this is being manufactured by the Israeli right in order to support the policies of the right, like the occupation of the West Bank, and they're very suspicious of claims that there is this deep and irrational hostility toward Jews, which they have never experienced because they grew up in a country that was created to solve the problem, at least for Jews. It is changing because in the world of social media and global communications, Israelis are much more exposed to what's going on outside. And if you're an Israeli academic or an Israeli movie director or an Israeli author, you're interacting with cultural institutions in the West, and you understand that there is a problem. But the average Israeli doesn't really. So I still have conversations with people where, I'll talk about the human rights industry and this kind of just vast and ferocious ideological campaign against the existence of the Jewish state and against anyone who supports it. And you can tell they don't really believe me. They don't really believe that it exists. It's not a problem for them in their day-to-day life. In their daily life, the problem is ballistic missiles being fired at them, from Iran, religious coercion by a right-wing and kind of catastrophically incompetent government. These are the things that they see day to day. And these bookstores are places they've never visited, and a Western college campus is a place they've never been. And it seems so theoretical to them that the impact on them is very hard to understand. Why should I care if I live in Tel Aviv what some kid at UBC is, hearing on the quad? And I try to explain why it actually is very important, or at least it's important to our communities in the diaspora who feel literally they feel the tectonic plates shifting under their feet. They feel the ground burning. But Israelis have so many more urgent problems that it's hard for them to really make that leap and understand it. So I think that's absolutely true, and it's a problem that I've had in trying to explain this to Israelis. The Gazology piece was actually a unique example of a piece that made the leap from North America to Israel, and it was actually read in Israel and discussed to some extent in Israel, and with Israelis saying, this is pretty weird. I mean, many Israelis have a critique of this government and of the Gaza war. So an Israeli might just glance at that shelf and say, okay, these are books about how we should have, gone in from the north of Gaza and not from the south, or we should have used less firepower, or we should have, done the war in 6 months and not in 2 years. And of course, that's not at all what it's about. But in order to understand that, it's you have to have had the experience of living as a Jewish minority in a Western country or in any country that isn't Israel. And that is not an experience that most Israelis have had.
Can I ask you the counter question? So, you're talking about how you're trying to convince Israelis why they should care about, college campuses baying for their blood. Now, the counter question is, and this is why I'm often writing about the topic of anti-Zionism. It's mostly from a Canadian perspective. So I'm not generally in touch with the day-to-day workings of in Israel or the war against Hamas or any of these things. But it sort of piques my interest because it strikes me as a sign of something that has gone wrong in Canada. There was a Canada where we didn't have this kind of rot in academia, in labor unions, etc. And now we live in a Canada in which you can have whole political parties defined exclusively by their obsession with Gaza. So, I approach it from whether this was any place on earth. If you suddenly had everybody just obsessed with South Sudan 24 hours a day, and you had insane hate rallies, in the center of Toronto every few days about South Sudan, I would have the same interest in it. So I guess from that perspective, if you're trying to explain to a Westerner who doesn't care about Israel and can't find Israel in a map, why they should care that there's entire bookshelves filled with insane masturbatory tapes obsessed with Gaza, what would you tell them this says about their society?
I think that these ideas, when they appear, and we've seen them appear over many, many centuries, and we listed some of them earlier, when you start having these obsessions with Jews as representatives of the evil of the age, when that starts happening, it is a massive red warning light blinking over any society, because it's a sign that rational solutions to problems are being abandoned. So, if you think the Canadian economy is tanking, then if you're a rational person, you take 5 steps to fix it. You work on the imports, you work on the exports, you cut a deal with the Americans, you cut down some more trees. I don't know, I haven't been in Canada for a long time, but those are, rational responses to an economic problem. But when you start saying, well, actually, the economy is failing because Jews are manipulating the foreign currency markets, or because there's a cast of globalists who are pulling the strings of the global economy, to their own benefit, that necessarily means that you will be unable to solve your problems, because that's not actually what's happening. And the solutions that you're going to offer to that imaginary problem are going to make solving your actual problems impossible. The Jews are not actually the problem in any society, arguably. except the one I live in, which is a Jewish state. So here we can have that discussion. But the appearance of these ideas is a sign of a failing intellect, and that's true in an individual. So if you meet a person who's raving about evil Zionists or Jews or Israelis or Netanyahu or whatever, that's a sign that this person's life isn't going well, that they've made a wrong turn, that things are off the rails, that they're unable to address the problems in their life. And that's true writ large in a society where you start seeing this appear, at universities across Canada, or when you start seeing it at universities across the West, when it appears at labor rallies of like auto workers in Southern Ontario, something's wrong. It's a sign that something's wrong. Now, there are many signs that things are wrong in Canada and across the West, and you've written about many of them, Tristan, which is why I appreciate your writing so much. This is one of the signs, and it's we have a very long history of the appearance of these ideas, and it always augurs ill for whatever society that is afflicted by these ideas. It augurs ill first for Jewish people, because these are ideas that are not really about real Jewish people, but they impact the lives of real Jews who, find it very difficult to live in places where this is happening, and we're seeing it happen. We've certainly seen it happen in France. We're seeing it happening in a big way in the UK. Much to my dismay, we're seeing it happen in Toronto, where I'm from, in Montreal, and other parts of Canada. We're seeing it to some extent in the United States, but less. But so that is, one effect that it's going to have, and that's a big deal for Jewish people. But more broadly, it's a sign that things are slipping. And I think that that's a reason to pay attention to this and try to avert this trend before it makes things worse than they already are.
So the inspiration for Gazology comes from your standing in an independent bookstore, probably a couple Progress Pride flags, probably smells pleasant, So you're basically at the epicenter of sort of, your bourgeois progressive, it doesn't get any more bourgeois progressive than, the center of an independent bookstore. So I was wondering if you can speak to the fact that at least among, growing up in Canada, and certainly among Jewish organizations in Canada, I think there was this inclination to think that, well, Jew hatred comes from the right. You have to, it comes from militia groups. It comes from neo-Nazi groups. That's who we need to keep an eye on. And that's where your sort of classic Jew hatred comes from. And then suddenly you're in the middle of an independent bookstore in the center of Toronto. I don't know where it actually was, but I mean, this describes any independent bookstore. So it strikes me, when we look at the trends of the last 2-3 years, this is essentially the left found a way to be Jew haters, and they found a permission structure, and then all of these organizations that you trusted to be progressive, to be screened from hate, have been moved into the sort of Jew hatred sphere. And that's kind of what you're covering in Gazology. I mean, these are all people who would consider themselves extremely progressive. They're taking issues that are important to progressives and just sort of, Greta Thunberging them. I'm done with the climate. No, I'm on hating Israel. So now that you're sort of an expert in these various books, could you speak to, is there a reason that this has become more entrenched than any Jew hatred we've seen, certainly in the last few decades? Is this essentially, we didn't have any defenses on the left in progressive institutions, and that's how it's swept in so thoroughly, and that's why we don't have whole bookshelves full of right-wing Jew hatred, but we do have whole bookshelves full of left-wing Jew hatred?
Right. I mean, those bookshelves of right-wing Jew hatred probably exist. You can probably find them on Amazon. They might not be on a physical bookshelf, although who knows? There's a lot of bookstores I've never been in.
There's self-published and there's bad graphic design, but
right, exactly,
it's not institutionalized.
Exactly. That's probably true, because the institutions are liberal, and the kind of capture that we've seen in the institutions has been a hard left capture rather than a hard right capture. Yeah. And I love independent bookstores. I'm an author, and I've written 5 books, and an independent bookstore is the kind of place where I used to feel right at home. And the truth is, if I ignore the Middle East section, I can still do it. It's just getting harder to ignore that section because it's so big and so loud. I'm not sure that if the Jews had their censors turned on the left, that it would have made a big difference. To be honest, the Jews are a very small number of people. I mean, the entire global Jewish population is a lot smaller than the population of Cairo. So I tend to have a limited, expectation of what Jews can actually do. So even if people had been really on top of things, and on the U of T and the U of T liberal arts departments and in the unions and in Amnesty International or wherever, I'm not sure it would have made a big difference. This stuff has been percolating on the left since the late 60s. So if you look back, you'll see Soviet representatives talking about Israeli genocide in the late 60s. And it was happening because the Soviet Union realized what we now know, which is that this is an incredible mobilizing idea, because you can mobilize people across the world with the idea that Jews are evil. It works in Russia, it works across Europe, it works across the Islamic world. And the Soviets were very interested in kind of mobilizing these parts of the world against the West. So that's when you started seeing, the United Nations resolutions from 1975 saying that Zionism is racism. So the idea that Israel is apartheid and genocide and racism, these are all old Soviet Marxist ideas that kind of percolate through the university departments for a couple of decades. They're on the fringes. My dad was a professor at University of Toronto, and he's seeing this stuff in the 90s. So it's already there, pretty much, dominant in the departments in the 90s. And then it really explodes in the aughts when the graduates of all of these departments kind of take over the jobs in the press and the government and the human rights world and the NGO world. And the older generation that used to know what they were doing and have a strong sense of what Canada is or what the UK is or what Western values are, these people kind of fade out, and we get a kind of a generation of fairly, I hate to use this term, but kind of feckless boomers who just don't have a clear idea of why their countries exist and what they're meant to do. And you have this very kind of energized generation of activists moving into all the positions. And then by the time I'm in the AP, 2006, to 2011, these institutions are already being turned into megaphones for hard left ideology. It's not just the AP. I just happen to work there. It's happening, across the board. And October 7th happens and it kind of explodes. And then we notice that all of our institutions essentially have been transformed into something else. So, the New York Times might still have that beautiful font on the front page, but it's a different institution than it was 20 years ago. And the Democratic Party might still call itself that, but it's not the same party it was 20 years ago. And that's true of Human Rights Watch, and it's true of a big part of the NGO scene. It's true of the Liberal Party of Canada, obviously. It's certainly true of the NDP. These institutions have been changed by people, again, absorbing really bad ideas in universities and then realizing that these ideas have power to mobilize. This idea, the anti-Zionist idea, has the power to mobilize an incredible coalition. I mean, you can march on the streets of Toronto with fundamentalist Muslims, queers for Palestine, labor unions, disaffected white kids from the universities, the professors of gender study. I mean, there's no other cause that can bring all of those people together. So it is, it's very useful. And as soon as it's recognized to be useful, there's almost no way to stop it, because someone's going to use it.
This is my last question, although we can have some spin-off questions from this. Is there any note of optimism that you may have after reading all these? Is there any feeling of these are so absurd, they're so obnoxious, that at least if you'd read all these books and they were beautifully written and very convincing and works of arts, that would arguably be a worse outcome than what you actually encountered. So do you come to the end of this that, well, at least it's only fooling a very specific type of person? So, as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, how are we going to see this in the year 2070? Are we just going to look back and this is some insane, this is in the closet with the disco suit, we're all embarrassed about it. Oh yeah, everybody lost their mind. We hated Jews in the halls of academia. No, that's all behind us. So anyway, is there any upside to this when you're seeing the state of literature as reflected through a Gazan lens?
Right. Are we going to remember it like the lava lamp? I would like to say yes, but I think that the answer is no. And I think that it's a symptom of a breakdown of our institutions and to some extent our countries. So the idea that we're going to sit in a country that looks like Canada looks like now in 2070 and look back kind of with and reminisce about the crazy 2020s, I don't think that's the direction it's going. And I think that the structures that we grew up in, the post-World War II world, those structures are all breaking down. I mean, the United Nations, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the classic political parties of Canada. The countries cannot be maintained if they don't have a really strong idea of what they're doing and if they don't have people who are willing to sacrifice to preserve them. And most countries across the West no longer have those things. So when I imagine where we're going to be sitting in 2070, of course, I don't know, but I am quite sure that it is going to be in a world that does not look like the world we're in right now. And these ideas are a symptom of a breakdown. It's not a fad. If it was just a few crazy books, I would say, oh, whatever, there are all kinds of literary fads, it's 50 Shades of Grey, and the things come and go. But we're talking about books that are being pumped out by the mainstream publishing industry. There are dozens of titles in the pipeline that we're going to see in the next year. These books are going to be taught to university students in disciplines from anthropology to medicine. People are going to be encouraged to see evil in the world through Gaza, meaning that the barrier between us and the perfect world we want to see is Jews. That is a very resonant and deep idea that's wired into the deep psychology of the West, and things are going to get a lot crazier before they get better. When we see these things happen in the past, and again, we have many precedents for the emergence of these ideas, it usually ends tragically for Jewish people who are either expelled or subject to violence. And it's a sign of a society that can no longer solve its problems in a rational way. And if you can't solve your problems in a rational way, then there's reason for real concern about the future of your country.
Is there at least one element, and when I look at sort of the course of the anti-Zionist movement here in Canada, when they're burning a Canadian flag in the center of Vancouver, when they're blockading pride parades, there is a part of me that's thinking, this is probably for the best, because you have a lot of people who weren't aware of the extremism within these movements, and now they're seeing a flaming Canadian flag. Now they can't even march in a pride parade. So, I have seen, obviously, things are very bad, but I think your average not tuned in Canadian, and I cannot stress how tuned out most Canadians are of this. I think you are at a point. Yeah, I think you are at a point where people may not know where Israel is, what Gaza is, but when they see the Palestinian flag, they're like, the last 10 times I've seen this, it's because traffic is being blockaded and some, young guy in a dressed like a terrorist is screaming at me. So it's just this knee-jerk, this is a bad thing. So is there any note of optimism in that you're reading these books and it's just so unhinged that it's hard to imagine that someone, I'm going to read about the war in Gaza, and they read this and say, oh, this is nuts. I can't sign on with this. Is there any element of that where you're thinking, they're so far gone that there is an entrenched and radicalized group of anti-Zionists that is a problem for all of us, but they're so up their own ass. It would be very hard to bring in someone sitting on the fence at this point.
Yes, if you're looking for optimism, I think there is something in that. And when I speak to my Canadian friends from Toronto, people who aren't in the Jewish community, they've become aware of this because they don't like disorder. Canadians don't love seeing disorder on the streets. They don't like seeing protests blocking traffic. It's not Canadian, and people don't like it. So, they might not have sympathy for Israel necessarily. The average Canadian probably just doesn't really care about this either way, but they just don't like the disruption of order. And I think that's true of a lot of people. However, it would take so much, as you know, and you've written about this, it would take so much to put things back on track. Things have gone really, really far, and the institutions to a very large extent have been captured by people who have very different ideas, including, I listened to the Prime Minister of Canada speak, and, he completely misunderstands the world. Certainly Israel's place in the world, but I think Canada's place in the world, and he understands what is going on and applies this very moralistic language to an issue that he clearly does not understand. So none of that bodes well for Canada's ability to adjust its course. It's not just the anti-Zionist thing. It's the this happens to people who, encounter the gender stuff and say, whoa, I didn't, or, to some extent, the awareness of Indigenous issues in Canada, which is a good thing. But when it crosses a certain line, the average Canadian's like, wait, just a second, I'm not into that. But that is going to have to find some kind of political expression that can actually correct the institutions, which is not just a matter of replacing the government, because as you mentioned when you talked about those 300-page government reports, this stuff is deep in the institutions. These ideologies are deep in the institutions of Canada. You're going to meet them in the police departments. You're going to meet them in the Justice Department. You're going to meet them in various government agencies. Correcting course is going to require a jump in awareness and a massive effort. And I love Canada, and I was born there and grew up there, but nothing about my experience of Canada suggests that either of those things is likely to happen in the near future. I would love to be corrected, Tristan, if I'm wrong about that.
Well, I'm sure all of us reading Gazology would be a good first step. I'll throw it back to Ms. Eskenazi, but thank you, Mr. Friedman.
It's been a pleasure speaking to you, Tristan.
Thank you both so much for such a fascinating conversation. I'm so pleased that you could join us tonight. As someone whose academic work personally focuses on narrative and culture, I find the concept of Gazology incredibly useful because it explains something that many people have sensed intuitively, that Israel-Gaza is increasingly no longer treated simply as a conflict, but as a symbolic moral framework through which people unpack the problems of the world. And as you pointed out tonight, Matti, Jews themselves increasingly also become symbolic within that framework as well, cast as whatever a particular ideology is decided represents the ultimate evil. And in an increasingly complicated and morally ambiguous world, these narratives offer something very seductive: clarity, a simple story of good and evil, oppressor and oppressed, and they become the new modern fairy tale in a way. As you said, when we see these things happening, it's a signpost that rational responses to problems have failed. And this should be important to all of us, not just Canada's Jews, but as citizens and participants in a democratic society. So I thank you both again for this amazing discussion, and thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time.